All right. Once again, I'm Drew from the admission office. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Happy Sunday. A few housekeeping items. First, closed captioning is available. The CC button is on your bottom menu, and you can click that if you choose. Second, also, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to do our best to answer those both as we go along and also at the end. I'm really excited for you to be here tonight, but I'm even more excited to have Nicole Cunningham from the Office of Financial Aid here with us tonight because she would do a much better job than I would of telling you about the CSS profile. She's got a great PowerPoint. So without further delay, Nicole, take it away.
Fantastic. Welcome everyone this evening. As Drew said, my name is Nicole Cunningham, Director of Financial Aid at the College of the Holy Cross, and we're going to jump right into this event. So for the next 15-20 minutes, we are going to chat with you about the CSS profile. And to talk about the CSS profile, we're going to go into depth on some questions. So what is actually the CSS profile application? What do you as a student and or parent need to do to complete that application? And what do you need to complete the actual application? How do you go about completing the application for the CSS profile? When is the best time to complete the CSS profile? What happens after you file the CSS profile? And then we're going to save about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. But as Drew said, please feel free to drop your questions as we go along into the Q&A chat. So first order of business, what is the CSS profile? The CSS profile is a financial aid application that includes income and asset information for both students and parents to determine eligibility for need-based funding from a college or university. It is not to be confused with the FAFSA or the free application for federal student aid. This application is managed by the College Board. And one thing to make note of, with the FAFSA application, colleges and universities across the country will ask for you to fill out the FAFSA, but not all schools will require you to fill out the CSS profile. So it's important when you're doing your research on applying to the various colleges and universities that you're interested in to see what forms are actually required.
Well, can I ask a quick question? Where would folks find that information about whether or not a college
Absolutely.
requires the CSS?
That's a really great question. And what I would suggest is when you're starting to compile your list of schools that you're interested in applying to, you make a point to go directly to each school's financial aid website. And on the financial aid websites, the colleges and universities will list out for you what forms are actually required of you when you're completing the application process for admission. So some schools, as I said, may require the FAFSA application. Other schools may require the FAFSA and the CSS profile, or some schools may not require the profile, but they may have their own institutional application. So it's really important for you as you're going through that admissions process to really get a handle on what the financial aid piece is, especially if financial need and financial concern is important to you and your family. With that said, oftentimes one of the biggest questions that we'll get in our financial aid office is, well, we filled out the FAFSA application, and it seems like a lot of the questions are very similar. Why do we need to complete the CSS profile? And what's the difference between the two forms? So we're going to talk about that next. Comparing the FAFSA and the CSS profile at the forefront, both the FAFSA and the CSS profile are going to ask you to provide us with 2020 income information from both the student and the parent. That information will include taxable and untaxed income, information about your household size, and asset information. And that's pretty much where the similarities end. With regards to the FAFSA application, the FAFSA will only ask of you, at least presently, that's what the rules are, to complete information as it pertains to the custodial parent. The CSS profile will ask you for information about both the custodial and non-custodial parent. And before I continue, one of the other biggest questions that we'll get in the office is, what does that mean? What does non-custodial mean? What does custodial mean? And so the best way to explain that to you is a custodial parent. If students have parents who are separated or divorced, a custodial parent would be the individual who you live with more than 50% of the time. The non-custodial parent is considered to be the parent that you live with less than 50% of the time. So as the FAFSA instructions state, you would be filling out as a student your information with your parent that you live with more than 50% of the time. And the CSS profile is going to ask you to file information for both parents. Additionally, one of the things that the FAFSA does not ask for is home equity. Home equity is not considered in terms of an asset when completing the FAFSA, nor does retirement income or total retirement value get factored into the FAFSA application. On the other hand, with regards to the CSS profile, it does consider home equity as a measure of a family's overall financial strength, and it will ask for information about the value of your retirement, but in actuality, it's more for data analysis and data statistical reasons. It will not be counted in the overall calculation for a family. In addition, the FAFSA will ask a parent or student information about whether they own a business. But with regards to the business, you would only report that information on the FAFSA if the business has fewer than 100 employees. Conversely, with regards to the CSS profile, it doesn't matter how many employees a family member may have in a business, that information is going to be factored in to the calculation. So all businesses would need to be reported. Another big difference between the FAFSA and the CSS profile is that the FAFSA is free to submit, hence the name, Free Application for Federal Student Aid. With regards to the CSS profile, there is an application fee to the student and family when you're submitting that application. For the first school that you indicate on the CSS profile, the College Board will charge you $25. For each additional school that you add to the CSS profile, they are going to charge you an additional $16 per school. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you qualify for a fee waiver based on the completion of your SATs, based on the fact if you're an orphan awarded the court and under the age of 24, or you meet certain income criteria with respect to family income, you may be eligible to have those fees waived. An example where a family may be eligible to have the fee waiver is if you're a family of 4 and you have total income of $45,000 or less. The last thing that I do want to mention about the FAFSA and the CSS profile that is not here is that the FAFSA application can only be completed by US citizens and permanent residents. The CSS profile, on the other hand, again, that's the application that we use to determine our institutional dollars, can be completed by US citizens, permanent residents, and international students. So it's really important if you're looking to apply to a college and you are an international student, that you make sure that you complete the CSS profile application. So what exactly do you need when you're filing the CSS profile? We'll go over a few things here. First and foremost, you're going to want to have information about both 2020 and 2021 income and asset information for both parents and students. And that can come in the form of a variety of different things. Federal tax returns, W-2s, any type of untaxed income, and 1099s are going to be important pieces of information that you're going to want to have at your disposal pertaining to income when filling out the CSS profile. Current bank statements, investment statements, any records of savings, stocks, bonds, 529 plans, information about other real estate that you may own, likewise any business information is what you're going to need to have on hand when you're filling out the asset section of the CSS profile. The next question, how do I actually go about completing the CSS profile? On your screen, you will see an image of the College Board site or the CSS Profile site that you will get once prompted by completing the link of cssprofile.collegeboard.org. So that is the link, or that is the page that should show up. What you will need to do is create a College Board username and ID, or username and password, excuse me, for this student. But at the same time, if you've completed the SAT, PSAT, or you have applied for AP testing, you can actually use that same username and password to complete the CSS profile. You'll next sign in with that information, and then you're going to complete the application. One of the biggest questions we'll also get when it comes time to actually filling out the application is, do I have to complete the application in one sitting? Because it is, they do ask a lot more questions than that of the FAFSA, and it can be a bit overwhelming for people. And so the answer to that question is no. You actually do not need to complete the application all in one sitting. So you can start to fill out all of your demographic information. You can start to enter some information pertaining to your income or your parents' income, and then you can put a pause on completing the application and saving it. And you can go back to a later time when you have the rest of the information, perhaps that you didn't have at the initial time that you were submitting the form, to then be able to finish that off and submit the application, which is the next step. After you've submitted the application, you will be able to go directly to your CSS profile dashboard using the username and password to be able to see what the status is of the application and to review it for any errors.
Nicole, let me ask a kind of a silly question.
Sure.
How long would you expect it would take parents or a parent to fill out the CSS profile? Are we talking, can they pop on their computer and whip this out in 30 minutes? Is it going to take a little bit longer than that? Understanding that they may or may not have all the information readily available in front of them.
Yes, so depending on the information that you need to provide, whether you have a more simplistic application in that, the parents are straight wage earners, so there's no businesses, there's no other real estate, there's not a lot of asset information. It could take probably about 30 minutes or so for someone to sit down and complete the application. When there are more layers with regards to business information, as I said, other real estate information, and the like, then it could take upwards to an hour to complete that application. Clearly, if you start and stop and start and stop, it's hard to gauge in terms of how long that will actually take you to complete it. But I would say no more than an hour. Likewise, one of the things that I know, from our experiences here at Holy Cross and with some other institutions is that anytime there's questions that people have or they don't understand what they need to do or how they need to complete the form, you should always reach out to your financial aid office for which you're applying to, or the school that you're applying to. That way there, you have the opportunity to get those questions asked, and people along the way are willing to help you in filling out that form. So it's really important to not be afraid to call the financial aid office and ask questions and get some assistance in helping complete the form.
And one more question, kind of in the same vein. How do you know if you've made a mistake? Like, I know sometimes when I'm filling out forms like this, especially where numbers are involved, I'm trying to double check it, but is there a way to know that I've really screwed something up and made a mistake? Would I know it in the moment, or would I find out about something like that afterwards?
That's another really good question. You may not necessarily know it in the moment that when you've completed the application, that there could potentially be an error that was made. So once you've submitted the CSS profile application, very much like what you do with the FAFSA application, is wait a day or so. Once the schools receive the information, then you can log back in and be able to revisit all of the questions that you've answered And I would say make sure that you have all of the information that you use to complete the CSS profile next to you when you're comparing the information. And if you see that there's errors being made, this year the College Board is going to be allowing students to go back in to make some changes to their CSS profile application. So you'll be able to do that and upload it. Otherwise, you would want to contact the schools with which you applied and notify them of what the errors were so that we have the correct information. So the next important question is, when should I actually complete the CSS profile? The CSS profile goes live on October 1st of each year for the upcoming academic year. So for this year, October 1st is the date with which students can start to fill out the CSS profile for the 22-23 academic year. Now, deadlines will vary based on each school's preference and based on when you're looking to apply to a college. Some students may be applying early action, other schools may be applying early decision, other students may be applying regular decision. So one of the tips that I will always share with students and their families when filling out financial aid forms is take a look at all of the schools that you're looking to apply to. Visit the websites that we talked about a few moments ago and see what not only what forms are required, but what the deadlines are for those schools. And make a list, put that into a Google sheet, put that onto an Excel spreadsheet, put it on your in notes on your phone, and find which school has the earliest filing deadline and submit your application, not just for CSS Profile, but even for the FAFSA. Submit your applications by that deadline. That way there, you know that all of the schools have received the information. One other tip that I'll share in here as well is that you want to make sure when you're filling out this information, you're making sure that you're using the right school code because you don't want to have something inadvertently sent to another school. Case in point, we are the College of the Holy Cross. However, there is another institution by the name of Holy Cross College out in the Midwest. And we have had incidences in the past where someone has applied to schools out in Indiana and was just typing in the name of the school and not selecting the actual school code. And they had their information sent to the school out in Indiana versus College of the Holy Cross. So before you actually press that submit button, you want to go through the list of schools with which you want to have the information sent to, just to make sure that those are the schools that you're looking to apply to and you want to have your information sent to as well.
I've got another kind of obvious question, Nicole. FAFSA and CSS, are they usually due at the same time?
That is a really good question. Yes, many schools will ask that both the CSS profile and the FAFSA application be submitted at the same time. And the reason for that is because when a school is reviewing financial aid information to consider a student for financial assistance from their institution or from funding from the federal government, when a student is admitted to the college, the information has to be all turned in at the same time so that we can present you with a financial aid offer. And the financial aid offer would be based off of both the FAFSA and the CSS profile information. So it's important to have the information in at the same time. Now, if someone completes the FAFSA application on October 1st and doesn't complete the CSS profile application until October 31st, that's okay, as long as you have it in by the actual financial aid deadlines for that particular school. And if you run into a situation where there is something unexpected that happens within your family and you need an extension to file the forms, or it's going to be submitted a day or two late, you should always reach out to the individual schools that you're applying to, just to make sure that there aren't going to be any issues with you getting that information in a couple of days past the deadline. That's another common phone call that we'll receive in our office. Students have some questions in filling out the form and they're not able to get the answers to those questions in time for the initial submission date? Does that force them to forfeit their application? I can speak to Holy Cross, and the answer to that is no. We will always work with students who are reaching out to us and who submit information within a reasonable time frame, but it's really important to make that connection with those individual schools.
And one last question, and I think it's probably a yes or no. Is it okay to apply for financial aid, FAFSA, CSS, before the student has even applied for admission?
Absolutely. And the reason for that is because many institutions only have a certain amount of resources that they're able to determine an offer to students. And in completing the forms on time or really shortly thereafter, but ideally the goal is always to be on time as much as possible, that ensures that when an offer of admission is made for a student, the financial aid offer can follow. We've had experiences in the past, and again, I'm speaking to Holy Cross, where a student submitted information after their admissions offer had been extended, and we had already committed our funding. So we're not able to extend additional consideration from an institutional standpoint. Federal funding is always there, but institutional funding is not always there. So it's really important to make sure that application materials are submitted prior to any notification of admissions. And so moving ahead, next question is, what happens after I complete the CSS profile application? Once you've completed the CSS profile, as I've mentioned, you'll be able to view the status of that on the College Board website and be able to see that a report of the information that you've provided will be sent to the schools that you've indicated. So as I said, this is really important for you to make sure that the list of schools that you have coincide with the admissions applications that you are looking to also submit. College Board will allow you to go back in if you've accidentally omitted a school, or at the 11th hour, you've decided you're going to apply to another institution or 2 other colleges, to go back in and add those schools if they require the CSS profile. So that is something that you can do. So it's not a one and done deal. You do have the ability to add schools afterwards, but you want to make sure that you try to get that through in the first pass. Once the report is sent to the various colleges and universities, an email will also be sent out to the non-custodial parent if you are in a family situation where that is the case, for that individual to complete their CSS profile and provide subsequent information if necessary. In addition to the CSS profile and the FAFSA, some colleges may also ask of you to submit some additional information, such as 2020 tax returns, perhaps a W-2, clarification regarding asset information, information about your household size. As an example, with regards to household size, there have been scenarios where a family may list 5 members in the household and 2 children in college on the FAFSA, but on the CSS profile, they might list 5 family members in the household and 3 children in college. So we want to make sure that we have the most accurate and correct information. So sometimes colleges will ask you for that. When an institution reaches out to you, whether it's through the College Board or whether it's through their financial aid email account or whether it's through your admissions portal, whatever it might be, please, 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 the best advice I can give you is do not ignore those requests. There's a reason why we're asking for that information. And just as I had shared that, it's not to one's benefit to apply for financial aid after an admissions decision, we want to make sure that we have all the correct information prior to making the admissions decision so that we're able to extend to you the best financial aid offer once you've received your admissions decision. So that's really important to not ignore those requests. If you don't understand what is being asked of you and need help with that, again, please reach out to the financial aid offices that have asked for that information to get further clarification. Our end goal always is to help students. And the more that we can develop that relationship with individuals, the better off it is for you, because if you've been extended an admissions offer and you have financial aid and you make a determination to attend a college or university, just like the academic departments, all of the other areas on campus that want to see you succeed as a student at their institution, so does financial aid. So it's always important to make sure that you continue to pay attention to all of the questions that are asked of you, whether it's through email, texting, whatever the means might be. Once we've gathered all of the information in terms of the CSS profile, perhaps some supplemental documents, the FAFSA application, and the college or university is notified that you've been admitted to the college, we will determine your financial aid eligibility and send out to you your financial aid offer. And so that is the process in terms of completing the CSS profile and what goes into that.
So Nicole, I have a question about how all these things get synced up. So FAFSA is coming from one website, CSS is coming from a different website. We've got the common application coming from a different website, going to a totally different office in a totally different building than yours. We've got all the documentation from the school, the recommendations, the transcript, all that's coming to your office. I think sometimes folks wonder, like, how do they know if this stuff has been received, number one, and how does it all get matched up? Like, how does your system know that our system has a student who's applied by that name? Can you make a little sense of that?
Sure. And so what will happen is we'll get a lot of information from both the FAFSA and the CSS profile. The CSS profile and the FAFSA will ask students to provide us, or to provide on the application, not only your names, your addresses, but your dates of birth and your social security numbers. For the FAFSA application in particular, when a student is enrolling at a college or university, oftentimes they may have a small loan or some type of federal grant that might be afforded to them. And the federal government requires us to keep track of the dates of birth and social security number to make sure that you in fact are eligible to receive those funds. As I said at the beginning of our session, in completing the FAFSA application, students who are US citizens or permanent residents are the only individuals who are eligible for federal aid. So we have to ensure that that information is listed on the application materials. And I know with the common application, it's not a question, it is a question for students to complete with regards to the dates of birth and social security numbers. And I know that social security numbers are not required. It is, however, helpful for colleges if the student does complete that information when submitting the common application, because it's just one other data point that we can check and verify and match the students. Some institutions like Holy Cross, utilize an admissions portal for collecting all of the information from your common application or your coalition application to your transcripts, to your letters of recommendation. And that information behind the scenes gets synced to the information with financial aid. So we have a mainframe system that the college uses, and that information gets transmitted to us, and then we'll transmit information back to that admissions portal. So if a student has filed the CSS profile application but hasn't filed a FAFSA application, we will keep record of that and we'll transmit that over to the admissions portal so that an applicant can see what's missing there. The applicant will also receive communications, often by email. We've thought about exploring some text opportunities there as well, but that's not a done deal yet. And so there are different ways in which you would receive communication from us to make sure that things have been received. Likewise, the only time in which we can actually sync up that information is when there's a formal admissions application. It is actually very challenging for us to be able to verify if a FAFSA has been completed if you haven't submitted an admissions application yet. CSS Profile is a little bit different. We have a much easier time to be able to view that information, but it is more difficult with the FAFSA. So best thing to do is if you're absolutely sure as far as what schools you're going to apply to, you want to make sure that you're also filling out your financial aid materials at the same time and kind of just get the ball rolling.
Another sort of obvious question, do families fill out the CSS profile each year that the student is in college?
Great question. And the answer to that is different from institution to institution. There are some colleges and universities that do require you to complete the CSS profile year after year. There are other colleges and universities that only require it of you if you are a first-time applicant, so in your freshman year, or if you didn't apply for financial aid in the freshman year, but you're looking for consideration in the student's junior year of college. Schools may ask you to fill out the CSS profile so that we can get a better understanding of what your family's financial strength is. But as I shared, the FAFSA only asks for so much information. The profile is much more comprehensive and truly gives a more finite picture of the family's financial strength. At Holy Cross, we are exploring the use of the CSS profile application. Currently, we do require it every year, but that's not to say down the road, we may change our minds. But for the time being, we do require that. Likewise, if there's any questions or concerns for anyone who's interested in Holy Cross who has difficulties with the CSS profile, my other bit of advice is to please reach out to our office and we can answer more general or more specific questions as opposed to answering them here this evening.
Just a few quick questions as we wrap up here tonight. When you're filling out the fields in the CSS profile, do you need to upload documents and statements or just report the information?
Unlike the FAFSA application, with regards to the FAFSA application, there is a partnership between the IRS and FAFSA as two government entities, whereby you can click a button and you can upload your tax information directly to the FAFSA. The CSS profile does require you to type in all of the information individually, so there isn't that partnership or relationship between the IRS and the College Board. To that end, when you're filling out that information, you want to make sure that you're filling in everything in whole dollar. So if you have a W-2 as an example, and your W-2 reads $45,256.19, you want to make sure that you're reporting $45,256 and not 19 cents, because otherwise it's going to show that you have $4.5 million as your W-2 earnings.
That would be great. So does the CSS profile, does that go to all schools, or or is it sort of like the common application where so many schools have like supplementary and special school questions, or is it just the standardized form that goes to all schools?
And the CSS profile, so long as you make sure that you've indicated the schools that you want the information to go to, it will go to those institutions. So if you're applying to 5 colleges and universities that require the profile, and you've listed those 5 colleges, they will get that information. If you've applied to 10, if you've applied to 20, yes, I've heard of people applying to 20 colleges, then you want to make sure all of those schools are listed. There is a basic set of general questions that are asked from all colleges and universities. And then each college and university may have some specific questions or what we call supplemental questions that we might ask. And it's just to try to get some more clarification on the information that is presented. And so you may have a question specifically for Holy Cross, and you may have something else for another institution. You want to make sure that you answer those questions. Likewise, again, if you don't know how to answer those questions or you're confused by them, you just need to reach out to the office and we can help you with that.
How about multiple children, whether it's twins or children in successive years? Do you fill out the CSS profile for each child?
So if you have twins or triplets or quadruplets, as an example, while they may all happen to have the same birth date, they are going to have different social security numbers. So, and they are their unique individual. So you would have to file a CSS profile application and likewise the FAFSA application for each child. When you have multiple children in college, so you may have a child right now who's currently a sophomore in college, and you have another child who's applying for freshman year. They're both unique individuals. They have definitely 2 different dates of birth and 2 different social security numbers. So you have to file 2 separate forms, one for each child.
Great. And I'm just going to ask one last question, Nicole, before we wrap up. Where is there a part on the CSS profile that people typically get stuck? And if they typically get stuck in that situation, what would you suggest that families do?
In terms of specific questions, I think oftentimes, that the challenge, one of the challenges can be the information pertaining to income. So when a student is applying or when a family is applying for financial aid for the 22-23 academic year, you will be reporting data that is from 2020. There is a segment on the CSS profile that asks you to complete information pertaining to 2021, and the year is not over yet. And then they ask you to project out information for 2022, and that year hasn't even happened. And so, I always advise families to try to use your best guess, especially for 2022, if you expect things to be similar to the past year, in the past 2 years. If you anticipate any changes, to make sure that you use your best estimate for that information. Oftentimes, families will also get hung up on some of the questions regarding asset information, in particular, home value and other real estate. So clearly on the CSS profile application, the home in which you live, if you do have ownership in that home and you have a mortgage on it, you want to make sure that you are providing the value of that property and the debt on that property. If you have a second mortgage, you want to make sure that you're including that in your total mortgage debt. And there is an additional question I think that they ask to clarify that, but make sure that you put that information on there. And then other real estate. If you happen to be in a circumstance where you do have a second piece of property, you want to make sure that you've listed that information. If you are a business owner, that's another question that from time to time families aren't sure how to answer that. And so you want to make sure that you are addressing those or ask the financial aid office if you need further clarification. The last thing that I would also share with the CSS profile, unlike the FAFSA application, there is a section on that form for you to provide colleges and universities with additional information. So if there's a certain life event, such as job loss or an illness, or a change in, let's say, a parent has moved for a new job, and now you have to maintain 2 households until you can get that other household. There is a section for what we call special circumstances, where you can provide some additional information to provide more context to what is transpiring with the family. Not everyone completes it. Some people do. Sometimes students will report if they've been notified that they're getting an outside scholarship. They'll report that information there. If a family happens to work for college or university and they're receiving tuition benefits, they might provide that information there. So it's a good place to put some more information to provide more context to schools.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nicole, for clarifying all of this and for answering all my questions. Thanks to all of our attendees tonight. Know that our webinar from last week about the FAFSA has been archived on our website. Tonight's webinar will be archived on our website as well. We're taking next weekend off. It's Labor Day. We encourage you to do the same. And we'll be back on September 12th with the next in our 4-part series on financial aid, paying for college, exploring your opportunities. That's on September 12th. Go ahead and please sign up when you can if you haven't already. And our 4th and final webinar is Financial Aid Fast Facts, and that'll be on the 19th. 2 more Sundays to go at 7 o'clock. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Please reach out if you have questions. Stay in touch, stay safe, and we're so happy you joined us tonight. Have a great night.